Hey, how's everyone doing today? Thanks for joining us for this episode of Vector Space Talk. I'm joined today by Rob Caulk from Emergent Methods. Hey, Rob, how you doing?
Hey, my name is Robert Caulk. I'm the CEO of Emergent Methods, and we do Ask News. That's our product. Ready to jump into some fun chats on deep research today.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much happening from all the stuff that's going on with DeepSeek, all the stuff that's going on with Perplexity, all the stuff that we've seen with the new Anthropic models, the AI agent stuff. But before we dive into some of that stuff, Rob, why don't you tell us a bit about Ask News?
Yeah, our goal is to provide a very high quality, we call it high octane fuel to AI applications, and that
Yep.
is some pre-built context that around the news. So if your AI agent, it needs quick context related to the current dealings between Trump and Zelensky,
Yeah.
you can either go scrape that and try to sort out from HTML all the way to your agent, or you can come straight to us, one line of code, boom, you have the clean, enriched metadata,
Yep.
a nice high quality picture of context.
Yep.
And that's our goal, high quality context, and
Nice.
trying to prove that as the main solution for high quality applications.
And you mentioned that you are looking at news articles. So can you talk a bit about the scale of news articles? So are you guys grabbing like one article a day, 10? How many?
Yeah, I mean, we're reading, and it's not even just news articles, by the way, but yeah, we probably ingest somewhere around 1 million documents per day. Now, how many of those are news articles and how many of those are like, police station reports and governmental alerts, and we're even
Mm-hmm.
tracking Telegram channels now. And
Wow.
so, yeah, it gets a little fuzzy about what is a news article and what is not, but
Yeah. Okay, so that is a great entryway into the conversation I want to have because I'd love to talk a bit. You just mentioned that Ask News has more than just news. So you've got these police reports, you've got this, what I guess you could call it alternative data for the news. How has the release of these models like DeepSeek and R1 affected how Ask News is looking at this process of gathering information?
I think it really validates the idea of needing quick access to enriched retrieval. And I think it's kind of, it's, deep research, this whole idea of deep research, it's just RAG, except
Yeah.
in a while loop.
Huh?
So it's
And for
smart
those
RAG.
that don't know what deep research is,
Yeah,
do you just want? I'll actually quickly give a
sure.
overview. It's this idea of currently, if you were to go to a website like ChatGPT or maybe even the Anthropic Workbench, and you say, "Tell me," tell me about Kobe Bryant, you're going to get a response back, but the response isn't going to be terribly thorough. It's just going to be the information that the model was trained on that has that Kobe Bryant information. The new paradigm that we're seeing is when you type in Kobe Bryant, the model's actually going to go to the internet, do research, and then provide you an answer with not only the information that it had stored in itself, but also information that it found online. Do you think that's a fair explanation of this deep research?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it doesn't even necessarily need to reach out. Now it does for sure, and I think that that is the RAG. And we've been, you and I, Quadrant and Ask News, we've been creating this place to reach out to for over a year and a half, 2 years now. So it's
Yep.
not super new. It's these new deep thinking tools because they have what are called thinking tokens.
Mm-hmm.
They can self-reflect on what they're trying to solve, and
Yeah.
that can help them reach even deeper parts within their own weights.
Mm,
So when you used to ask for Kobe Bryant, like you said, it would get you kind of a very superficial representation of what it knows about Kobe Bryant.
mm-hmm.
But now with these thinking tokens, it can kind of bring itself deeper into the parameter space that it represents with its weights to better answer your question because the parametric space, which is basically just all of the hyperparameters, the weights that comprise this model,
Yeah.
they're very deep. And when you used to just ask about Kobe Bryant, it just wouldn't scratch the surface. So it can actually do deep research without even reaching to the internet. But when you start introducing the internet and then a while loop on top of it where you say, okay, it thought about this, it came up with this, it wants to search for this, it found this, and now it's reflecting on this, and it realizes it needs to search for this. That's kind of the mind-shattering new DeepSeek O3 world that just opened up during the
Yeah.
past 2 months, maybe. I can't even.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
even
yeah.
think.
No,
Yeah.
it's pretty new, and we also just saw Anthropic released 3 point thinking,
Mm,
which is kind of their version of this model. So
yeah.
it seems like it's the new normal.
And it's great. It's a great new norm. I mean, the original question was, how does this affect Ask News? It's perfect for Ask News because
Uh-huh.
the issue with Ask News is there's so much news.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, one retrieval, we did really well getting you very relevant information on one retrieval,
Okay.
but it's just the tip of the iceberg of what you could reach, especially when that first retrieval gives you information about where you should probably search next, and it's
Mm.
probably a completely different part of the vector database. That
Uh,
means that it's a very dynamic search, that you can only know where to search in the second step by doing your first search and
yeah.
then using thinking token reasoning on top of it. So now people have to hit Ask News multiple times, right? But that's great because now they're getting, okay, I'm asking about the Trump-Zelensky deal. I want to know what's going on in Ukraine. And then news comes back. Well, Trump and Zelensky are fighting. Oh, okay, now I realize I should probably figure out what's the deal with all these minerals. Does Ukraine ever actually have a lot of minerals?
Yeah.
And then get news about that. And then all of a sudden it's like, why is the EU fighting about this? And all of a sudden you have this massive tree. It makes a lot of sense for news. So for us, it's perfect. It's
Yeah. Almost like it's replicating the human flow a little more, right? Where if
yeah,
you're researching a topic, you're gonna go research it. If you're researching linear regression, you go research it. You're like, oh, there's matrix stuff. I need to go research that, right? Which is a
exactly.
completely different direction than your original search, but you're getting to the same destination. I really like that analogy. That's really cool. And I just briefly want to get your opinion on what do you think about DeepSeek O3, Perplexities R1. Do you think these models deserve all the hype that they're getting? Or do you think that maybe since we're seeing something new we've never seen before, we're giving them a little too much credit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like speculating, and I'm happy to be wrong, proven wrong here in a few months, or maybe in
Yeah.
a day, based at the.
I mean, at the speed where they're moving, yeah, it could just be tomorrow.
I don't know. I mean, in my opinion, I think that they demonstrate one very powerful path of exploration with reasoning. And I think that it appears to be a very good new norm that you can set, but it opens up an unlimited number of ways to work with thinking tokens. So just the idea of thinking tokens is kind of a fundamental, I think it's a really strong fundamental tool. But then how you build on top of those, it seems nearly unlimited. And so
Yeah.
I think O3 and how they're handling internal reasoning is totally different from DeepSeek and how they're handling it. And that's good. That means that we still haven't found the correct way to do things. But I do think that it appears to be a really fundamental shift just because we're seeing such high quality outputs coming out of them.
Yeah. And I think we're going to start to see these niches get adopted a little more by the model providers, especially the frontier ones, where you're already seeing Anthropic kind of say, we don't really care about generating text. We're going to focus on generating code. And I think that you're going to start to see the model companies decide, hey, we have this niche. We're going to try to be the best in this niche as opposed to being the everything model that can do everything. And maybe that'll be OpenAI's niche, where they say, hey, we do everything slightly above average, but we're not the best at anything anymore, right? Which is kind of crazy to say out loud. But that's the reality of the world we currently live in, where I think Anthropic's kind of given up on those creative tasks and they're saying, we're going to focus on code because that's what people are using these tools for.
That's interesting because, I mean, that brings up a ton of points from my side. One, we are writing news stories on Ask News. So the front page of Ask News, that's our copy. And we have an editor behind the scenes who's human in the looping this stuff. We've done iterations upon iterations across a variety of different frontier models.
Yeah.
And we came to the conclusion that Claude 3.5 was leagues beyond the others in how it was adhering to our journalistic guidelines and how it was
Interesting.
relaying the information in a way that
Yeah.
was more compelling. And that
Yeah.
tells me it's more text and less coding. It feels a little bit different. But I've heard that people really like Claude for coding as well.
Yep, that's what I've been using lately, and the performance has definitely increased. It's been really fun being on Cursor from when it first came out to today, because I remember when you would ask Cursor Chat, like change the background from black to blue, and it would just freak out and break.
Yeah.
And now you can do pretty advanced stuff. Definitely going to be coming out with some content on how you can use Cursor to build stuff, because even people who don't know how to code, I've gotten them up and running with Cursor and Quadrant. So I think the models are getting so powerful now that the real expertise is coming from that domain knowledge and knowing how to put the pipes together, and not necessarily the actual process of putting the pipes together.
Yeah, but okay, so this is one thing that I'm observing, and I'm really curious to see how it unfolds. This idea of vibe coding, and I've never coded before, and now I've created an app.
Yeah.
And you see these kind of horror stories floating around LinkedIn where it's like, oh, I had 4 months of work and then I didn't commit anything, and then Cursor just destroyed it. Or like my project got so big that it's outside the context window and it just can't do the thing I need. And so I don't know, I'm a little bit at odds. I'm seeing Mark Zuckerberg is out there spewing, we don't need to hire developers. Google, Sundar Pichai is out there saying, yeah, we don't need developers anymore. These are smart people, and they've been around the block. They've been in the trenches. They know what a developer does. They know the abstract requirements that an engineer brings to the table outside of just connecting code.
Yeah.
Yet they're still trying to sell us on this idea that the engineer is no longer necessary. But then you hear about these horror stories, and it adds up. It's like, if you don't know how these abstract concepts generally should be connected, how could you just vibe code your way to an app? What's your opinion on it? I'm curious.
So I think it's very much a different kind of B2C market where these people are building apps and they're not even looking at the code. They have Cursor on one side of their screen, and then they did npm run dev on the other side. So they're looking at the local host of their site being built, but they're not looking at any code. And maybe they want to build a website that, like, I don't know, you can check the weather and order ice cream. So all they care about is, does this website give the functionality to check? They don't care about the edge cases. They don't care. They just care, hey, can we get this to a point where I can put a Stripe link at the bottom and the site says what it's going to do, what I want it to do. So then what will happen, as you kind of alluded to, is maybe your site doesn't have security, or maybe you didn't figure out your database correctly. All these kind of little things that people who haven't actually built apps wouldn't think about, right? To think about, hey, someone might be able to hack me because I'm not checking on the client side or whatever it might be, right? So I think there's a hard limit to where those projects can go. But the reality is these non-technical people can hire someone at that point, right? They can bring in someone and say,
now what? So it's just going to be a bunch of engineers cleaning up these cursor messes all over the place?
Yep. I think that's going to become a real that's where we're headed, I think. For sure. It's going to be a lot of people who are like, I can take your AI project and make it something that actually runs in prod. Because a lot of my work when I was on an ML team was taking these ML models from POC to prod, which is a whole process, right? And I think that's where we're headed, is to this kind of like bounty system where a lot of engineers are just going to be cleaning up other people's projects.
I'm also not convinced, I agree with you on that. I'm also not convinced that you can get to an app that is compelling at that. And here's why. Because if you think about even just writing, like, I don't think you can write a blog just from nothing.
Yeah.
Because you're just interpolating off of internet data. And the only time a blog is actually monetizable and useful is if it hasn't existed before, if the thought hasn't arrived and it's a unique, novel thought and people find it interesting and want to read through. But when you're just generating a bunch of interpolated text off of the parametric space, maybe you can find some little niches where it's like you could over-explore how you can take scikit-learn to do something else. But like, at no point do I see it, this whole idea of the billion-dollar AI CEO being able to, by itself, create some novel app and novel everything. I don't know. I still don't see it, but
yeah, I agree with you there. I think what's going to happen is it's more of a force multiplier, where before what might have taken a team of 6, now you can do with a team of 3. But I don't think we're getting to the point where it's like you don't need the team.
yeah.
I think it's just people are becoming more efficient and more productive with the tools.
And that's how it's been now for years, right? I think maybe it's just now the tools are becoming a lot more widespread
Yep.
and maybe accepted. But even when GPT 3.5 came out, I mean, at that point, you could already translate, Python to TypeScript if you wanted, or TypeScript to C++. And
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
it's not like, so I don't know if there's been this massive step change, but more of like we're hitting the hockey stick of awareness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's maybe that's causing that huge market is driving a bunch of tool making around
Yeah.
kind of assisting. It used to be a lot of like copy and pasting stuff, and like you said with Cursor, it's kind of grabbing context and doing the context engineering for you, which is awesome for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if it's actually has yet. Yeah, I don't see any super like version change just yet. But maybe
No,
it'll come.
I think what's happening a lot right now is this is the first time that we have these full stack AI apps like V0, Bolt, that will actually build you the full stack app. So I think that's where you're starting to see the proliferation of people saying, I can now build this app that before was just an idea and I would have had to pay someone like a lot of money to actually turn this into a real app. But now I can create that RAG app where I talk with my kid's schedule, something like that. And I think that people are basically saying, hey, it's not that hard for me to build a website where someone uploads a PDF and then I tell them about their kid's schedule. Let me just get Cursor to build it, and then they're using kind of their entrepreneurial know-how to market and sell it. So I think the big step that I'm seeing is this full stack automation, whereas before there was never a way to deploy your app. You could build a Google Colab notebook, you could have a Python script, but you couldn't have something that lived on the internet that was AI created. And I think
Yeah,
that's the big change.
that's true. Yeah.
Cool. I want to change gears a bit, and I have a question for you. I was recently asked this question, and I actually am curious as to your opinion. Do you think that you need to know what backpropagation is to build effective AI applications in 2025?
No. No, and I see this on LinkedIn all of the time.
Uh huh.
And it really feels to me like it feels like to me like the old guard gatekeeping a bit and saying like, oh, you don't know what dude, you don't need it. Or what I see on LinkedIn a lot is like, oh, I'm trying to hire an AI engineer. And when I put them through tests on architectures of neural nets, they fell apart. Or when I put them through, whatever. And it's like,
Yeah.
you're not looking, if you're an AI engineer, is someone who knows how to put together APIs to get you the IO that you want and put it in
Yeah.
the right place. If you
Mm-hmm.
want an AI researcher, that's a whole different. So I think that this old guard used to be kind of contained or used to be kind of all encompassing because if you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to deploy a neural net, you kind of did need to know a lot of the inner workings, and now you don't. And
Yeah.
that's good and bad. I mean, on one hand, it means we're abstracting.
Mm-hmm.
And when you abstract, you now bring people who have other creative ideas into the mix to start building on top of it. And that's awesome. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
assembly. And so that doesn't mean I need to know assembly to do cool stuff with a computer.
Yeah.
And so, no, I think that is absurd. And it really annoys me when I see that on LinkedIn. But maybe I'm
Yeah.
just sensitive at this point.
No, I'm starting to see that kind of coming back, that sentiment of you need that fundamental knowledge. And I was just curious as to your opinion because I kind of agree where I'm not exactly sure why you need to know what like a train test validation split is to do AI engineering work. But I think people just love to put those barriers up to kind of gatekeep. But you mentioned something which actually brought an idea to my head. Do you think we're headed towards a world where you're going to need a license to use LLMs? Same way doctors can't just operate, right? Headed towards a world where you're going to need some kind of license to use these tools because they just become that powerful.
Yeah. Um,
It's just
Good
kind of scary to
question.
think
I was
about.
thinking about, I think it's going to be more licensing, and this is total speculation, but I love speculation, and
Okay.
I'm sure we'll be wrong, but I've thought a little bit about it, and I think it'll be more about licensing as a company to deploy a
Yeah.
tool, and in that case, you're going to want to hire people that know their way around the use of the tools, especially if they're really sharp. If you're using a scalpel, something that's extremely dangerous in the sense of it can do a lot of harm as well as a lot of
Yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah. If you're like running the AI for nuclear education, then we're gonna have to double check that.
Yeah, right. Like that should probably have some kind of licensure.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know, but we'll see. That is an interesting question. I think it comes down to the blast radius, for lack of a better term, of
Mm,
like right now the blast radius is so small of
yep.
what could happen. And by the way, I think that a lot of the naysayers, the doomsdayers, I forget what his name is. There's one doomsdayer. He was popular at least 2 years ago. I think they've been a little bit disproven right now. Because they said, hey, as soon as you connect this thing to the internet, it's about to go run around and do everything it wants and destroy everybody,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it's game over from there. But we're
Hmm.
not seeing it. Also, like the self-improvement thing, they were a bit proven wrong because you have literal physical limitations with electricity and compute, and it's just hard to self-improve, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think a lot of the doomsdayers underestimated the level of capacity of the human brain relative to a bunch of GPUs, and now we're kind of in a position where I think we're realizing that this tech is actually not as scary and not as dangerous as maybe it was kind of hypothesized to be, but I could
Yeah.
be wrong.
I think when it first came out, it was so revolutionary that people's imaginations just kind of went crazy. But now we're kind of seeing a little more concrete what it can do, and it's like, yeah, it still struggles to edit CSS. I don't think it's going to take over the world anytime soon.
Yeah, and it needs to be really fully hooked up to do anything. And this includes a vector database. This includes hundreds of LLMs working in concert, to be quite
Hmm.
frank. Just the idea that one forward pass of inference through a single LLM is AGI is absolute absurdity. It's like when you talk to ChatGPT, you are closer to AGI because it's not a single forward pass, right?
Yeah.
They have layers and layers of tiny LLMs trying to build context and understand what's going on, and memorization in databases. And so it really does start to look a lot closer to a human brain at the end, where you need 700 forward passes to just do one response. And now
Yep.
we're looking at and now we come back to deep research, which is a literal while loop of forward passes
Yeah.
of just pumping tokens
Just
through
think about
this
this thing.
an
Yeah, yeah,
LLM.
yeah. It's like forcing a child to sit down and read.
Yeah.
You will eat your vegetables. One thing I do want to mention that we've been seeing a lot is companies like Cloudflare and Akamai are reporting that they're getting a lot more bot traffic on their websites, and that's becoming a much more valuable service because a lot of these websites don't want to pay for hosting for the LLMs. And I'm curious, how does Ask News navigate that? Because I'm guessing that you're doing a lot of bot stuff.
Yeah, if you don't want to be scraped, then we don't want to scrape you. Actually,
Okay.
we're mostly voluntary, right? So publishers will sign up with us and they will put Ask News Bot in their robots.txt
Yeah, they
committed
want. Mm-hmm.
because they actually want the royalties that we drive back to them.
Yeah.
So that's how we get around it. We say, hey,
Yeah.
your content has value. I don't want to dive too deep into it, but the idea is that we build a synthetic representation of their content. And so we don't actually store or pass the original expression. Instead,
Mm-hmm.
we just create the synthetic representation. And then if a developer needs it, a royalty goes back. And
Yeah.
so in that sense, they want the bot at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are plenty of websites that don't. And I'm curious to see how they fare because you're seeing actually, if you look at 2024 stats, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that publishers were pleasantly surprised by the amount of traffic that they got from GPT and Perplexity in 2024. Even though going into 2024, they were saying, you're going to
We don't
steal all
want.
of our traffic.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Nobody wants to read more than one sentence of news. All of these idiots are just going to go with your garbage output. It turns out people like citations and people want to follow through on a citation and read a full article.
Yeah.
Wow, it's absolutely revolutionary. So now New York Times wants to be indexed into
Hmm.
ChatGPT, right? They're
Yeah.
actually making a ton of money. That deal is huge, or It's maybe it's not New York Times. I think New York Times is suing OpenAI at this point.
Yeah, I think they might have been suing over the training data, but I know
Trainings,
that there's
exactly.
partnerships with other prestigious news
Yeah,
organizations
News
because,
Corp
yeah,
is partnered, and same with. I mean, there's quite a few. But
yeah,
we are seeing this idea of, well, actually, bot traffic is good because there are eyeballs somewhere. Now, are those eyeballs still sitting on this, Perplexities website? And does that matter at the end of the day? If you served your information to this person sitting on Perplexity, and your information was, well, here are the top 5 vector databases. Well, number one is clearly Quadrant. Number two is let's call it Milvus, and
yeah,
then whatever the next 3 or 4 are. That piece of information was very happily bot scraped to a human somewhere on the internet.
yep,
So in that case, it would not be a good idea for you to like switch on Cloudflare to try to block all these bots, right? So
yeah.
I don't know. I'm confused as to why you would shut off the bot
I
scraping.
think there's a bit of a digital divide going on, right? Because earlier I kind of mentioned these people who are vibe coding, and you can imagine someone might vibe code a website that wants to scrape the news.
Hmm.
And they're probably not offering the value that something like Ask News is offering, right? Kind of how you mentioned the sophistication of the application, where I think New York Times probably getting hit a bunch by people who are just building stuff that doesn't provide any value. And they're wondering, why are we paying to serve this website for your bot to come hit it for your little app? It's like Ask News makes sense because you're providing value, not only in terms of the royalties, but also we want to be the article that shows up when someone's Gaza news or whatever, right? We don't want it to be CNN. We want it to be New York Times. So it makes sense there. But when it's just a random developer who's vibe coding and they have an idea of, let me create a website
Yeah.
where there's sentiment scores under each article, and I'm just going to copy New York Times and scraping that, I could see why New York Times might be like, hey, we don't really want you to be scraping our website.
Yeah, I don't know. At that point, there's the okay, so the biggest issue that New York Times can complain about is, well, now we're not getting as much business because of whatever this thing is happening, whatever is occurring there.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some proof of competitive product. And if it's just a vibe coder who's putting together a POC, it's just not, doesn't really pass that test. There's no competition, no one's going there. Um, of course, if they get huge and they've built a news website that's based solely on literally copy pasting content from other websites, it's not a sustainable business practice and they'll be out of business very fast.
Yeah.
So I'm still not convinced that that is the problem. And it does feel a little bit strange to me that, first of all, the solution already exists. If you don't want someone to read your content without paying, then you put up a paywall. That is very basic and that works. That's very, very effective. So, and New York Times does this. They have, I think, the majority of their articles are paywall,
Yeah.
and that's great. That's a good business model. I'm happy for them. And they're going to give those paywalled articles to OpenAI or to Perplexity. They have a whole deal. That's fantastic. So I'm still struggling. Okay, so but you still want Google to come crawl the 1% of non-articles, non-paywalled articles.
Yep.
And this is because Google will index you into the Google search engine and people will get to you. So there's some
Yeah.
exchange of value. But
Yeah.
it means that nobody else could potentially index you to get you searchable, since no one else has that saturation that Google has to provide back the value. And that's why we just
Yeah.
have to pay royalties in the case of a paywalled article, especially because we have to literally have that direct transaction. But
Yeah, and
Google
that might have
can't.
made sense in our previous search landscape, but I think today that's really you're killing yourself if you're going to say we're only going to be on Google.
Yeah. Back when aggregators became a thing, this is an interesting fact is, so Google started aggregating news and a bunch of people said, well, this is not fair because now nobody's coming to our website. It sounds very familiar to what's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
And Spain said none of our news outlets can be indexed. Okay, boom. And Google said, fine, no problem. And then all of the visits and traffic to those
Just
Spanish news websites just dropped to nearly
yeah, and
zero
then they're
because they
like,
were no
okay.
longer indexed, they were no longer findable.
Yep.
Their information wasn't out. And not only that, but as a news organization, a lot of times your goal may not actually be to make money. A lot of them are nonprofit. Some of
Hmm.
them, their goal is to push ideas, ideology, push, philosophy and
Philanthropic.
yeah, they've got some other mission that's beyond direct money making. And so in that sense, you really do need people to crawl your content and copy links, backlink to other places on the web
Yeah.
and do all of this stuff. So they ended up reversing that, and it's just an interesting observation to see from the past that maybe that's happening now. A bunch of people
Hmm.
closed down, even bloggers. Like, I see these two types of bloggers. I see the bloggers who everything they do is 100% paywalled, and there's just nothing. I just have no way of reading or knowing who
Yeah.
they are or what they say, and that means I don't know who they are, and that means I never think about
I
them.
also wonder that as well because I'm not really paying for any of these like subscriptions or blogs and maybe I should be. There might be great information in there. I always wonder because I'm like, well, I can't see what's in it, so how would I know?
I don't pay for any Substacks or anything like that. Maybe that's
Yeah.
bad, but my
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. If anyone out there has a great Substack I should
yeah.
subscribe to, drop a comment, let us know.
There are other ways to monetize a Substack, and
Yeah.
maybe you could. I think I'm a part of a bunch of Substacks where they maybe 10% are paywalled, and that's great
Hmm.
for me because it's like, okay, I'm not a hardcore reader of you. I support what you do. I like who you are,
Yeah, yeah,
but I
yeah.
still know who these people are, and maybe at some point they'll have a merch drop or something, and I'll
And
grab
I'll
it. But
support
like,
you. Yeah.
I think. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting time to see how monetization of the web unfolds. I think
For
it's going to be
sure. I think I was having a conversation yesterday with a friend who's looking for a job, and he speculated to me he thinks it might be easier to build a company than to get a quality job. And I kind of laughed at him. I was like, okay, like you're going a little too far here. But the point kind of stands in terms of now with the tools we have, it's almost like you have to ask yourself, is my time better spent building something or trying to go find a job? It's like a real question. And I think that's an exciting new development where, like, now people might be going into a job interview and it's like, I don't have another offer in hand, but I do have a startup in hand. So you have to convince me to come work for you instead of working for myself.
There's definitely never been a better time to try a startup, only because of the unlimited variations of possibility that currently exist, which makes it very hard, but very open.
Yep.
So making the right choices is now exponentially more difficult than it was during the web. Because during the web, it was, okay, you need to get a website up. That's straightforward. And then you need to make sure that it works, and then you make money. That was it. Like there was three steps, and it was very straightforward. And you could do that over and over for companies, and you could just print money.
Yeah.
And now it's more like, how do I avoid OpenAI with a press release destroying my startup in one day, right? Like,
It's
which
brutal,
unfortunately happens.
man. I think that's why I'm so happy to be at a vector database. I see some of my friends at some of these other companies, and every single day it's like you're stepping around landmines because, yeah, a new feature might just kill your entire
I
company.
know.
It's
Like
so scary.
Gemini Flash with even
Yep.
just, yeah, the PDF ingestion. That,
Okay. All right. So I don't know if I've ever shared this story with you, Rob, but my first
go on.
job in tech was with the Department of Homeland Security for USCIS. And we were basically digitizing the process of form ingestion.
Hmm.
So if someone had like a tax form, a green card, EAD application, in the past, an adjudicator was looking at the application saying, oh, your name is Robert, you were born in. We digitized it so that all that information was just being pulled off the PDF. That was my full-time job, was creating bigram, n-gram models using PyTesseract, OCR to
Yeah,
create models to pull from those forms. Today, with something like Llama Parse, Flash, whatever, you can literally do it in seconds. So it's
with way
crazy to
higher
see
accuracy.
how, exactly, way higher accuracy.
It's
It's
wild.
crazy to see how just in about 5 years, what used to be a very high quality job at the Department of Homeland Security, I was being compensated very well for my time. Now it's just It's a SaaS product that you don't even need to pay for. You can just do
Yeah,
it.
but I'm sure your job has evolved over there to managing that sort of stuff, making sure that it is operating correctly and
Yep.
evals, making sure that it's not like going off the rails and
Yeah, so when our contract ended, we were underbid by a competitor who brought in a team that was half as big, and they cited AI as their reasoning. So I'm assuming that, yep, they were kind of headed towards that. It was right when ChatGPT was starting to come out that our contract ended. So that was like the very first vestiges of it. But of course, in the government, we couldn't use it because of PII.
yeah.
I want to switch gears here a bit and talk about vector databases and just data management in general and how you see this shifting moving forward with these new changes. So some of the stuff we're starting to see is, for example, using agents for your data management. And we're also seeing different kind of RAG applications where, for example, instead of just hitting your vector database, maybe you do some deep research with the vector database and online documents, kind of like you mentioned before. So I'm curious, what do you think about data management, vector databases in this new paradigm?
Yeah, I think at least the way we are looking at it, and this is kind of how we've looked at it from the beginning, is how far can we push it before you actually need an LLM call? And I think that hasn't changed. I think because that's the most expensive part of that pipeline. If you can get in and out of a vector database without talking to an LLM, now you're serving hundreds of thousands of calls per second for free. Nearly, maybe not free, but it's
Yeah,
very, very cheap.
certainly not the same cost as
Yeah.
the.
So I think that's part of maybe goes back to building a startup is, yeah, you could probably sit down and just say everything that happens and interacts with my vector database goes through an agent. And maybe you'll get something put together and maybe it will work quite well, but it won't be scalable and it won't be optimized. And so in that, to me, it's still the job is about deciding actually where do you really need an agent to sit and interact with this data and how far away can you push it. So to me, that's it's once you identify that point and once you solidify it, then it's very powerful because now you've created a kind of like a scaffolding of where you need reasoning and where you can still get away with traditional logic.
Yeah,
And once you've established that, you have a really, really powerful smart database, and that allows you to make incredible choices and to scale and to solve your problem in a very specific way. So once you get it set up right, it's great. But that setup, I think I think there's no way to do it without trial and error, without sitting down and finding out what works, what doesn't, what tools are currently capable of doing this particular task, and how accurate do I need this sort of task to be, or how flexible should this sort of task be? And those questions are just hard to get at if you don't just test and do a lot of trial and error.
yeah, and I think that that's kind of harkening back to what you mentioned earlier about that kind of barrier to how sophisticated a project can get if you don't know what you're doing. The things you just mentioned are things that Cursor isn't going to figure out for you. If you know you have to do them, then you can tell Cursor, but Cursor isn't at the level where it will be able to figure all that out by trial and error, right? So
Yeah,
someone who's
it won't
building
even
that
make a
out.
recommendation for you, right? Like it won't even say, this is a good place to put the agent. It will just put it there. And then, and great. And actually, it's good to know that it is actually kind of capable of interacting or putting agents in places for you. You know, I was kind of under the impression, I haven't used Cursor yet, but I was under the impression still some of these tools are not super up to speed with the latest and greatest because of their training data and they're trained on the past. But it sounds to me like it's,
No, their Cursor's super performant, and also it'll look at docs. So if you tell it to implement an agent for whatever, it'll go look at the docs for that library. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. But once again, if you don't know what you don't know, right? So you can build this app. Let's say you're building this RAG app. You're going to build it with Cursor. It'll work when you query it. But Rob or me might come in and say, oh, there's like tons of different things in here that you could optimize and make it better,
yeah,
right? So
no,
I
for
think that
sure.
that's kind of where it goes.
I think that the other kind of pothole that goes along with optimization is just the vector database itself.
Yeah.
We're still seeing people running around LinkedIn saying RAG is dead because of the new 2 million or 10 million token context window, and it's cringeworthy
Yeah.
because you realize this person has no respect for GPU VRAM. They don't realize what that costs, and that
Yeah.
alone already has disqualified them from any subsequent words that come out of their mouth. Unfortunately, because if you do realize that putting 2 million, all of your docs every single time just to look up one little portion of it
Yeah.
into all the VRAM in the world, if you think that that is a cost-worthy approach, then it's impossible. So the vector database is just unavoidable. It's not dead. I don't think it ever will be, because our goal is optimization of the most sacred resource, VRAM.
Yeah, I think it kind of reminds me of the people who maybe don't watch basketball saying, "Why don't they just dunk it every time?"
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
you're really close because
Yeah.
you're right. They should just dunk it every time, but it's like there's reasons why that's not possible.
But I do have a question about basketball. Why don't they just get a team of all the tallest people and they just
Yeah.
pass over everyone else?
I think unfortunately, due to wingspan and verticals, even the tallest people in the world would get their shots blocked by athletic, less tall people.
Yeah, maybe.
But I've always wondered for hockey, why not just put a sumo wrestler back there?
Wow, that's smart. Yeah, fill up the net. Just let them fill up the
Yeah,
net.
like I don't really get
That's
that one.
true, actually. That's
There
probably
must be a
illegal.
rule or something.
Yeah, there has to be. We should look that one up after. We have to ask ChatGPT about that one.
Yeah, exactly. Little brief segue. I'm curious, what do you think are some startup ideas for people who are watching this? Maybe they're looking to build a project, they're looking to get noticed by companies. What kind of projects do you think right now, not only for financial gain, but also just to show people you know what you're doing? If you were looking to hire, what are some projects that you would be impressed by?
Good question.
I can start while you're thinking if you.
Yeah, you
So
start
for
out.
me, the apps that impress me the most are you taking some kind of data set that lives on the internet. So for example, I just did this with the Steam Games data set. It was posted on Hacker News. It's a data set of all the games on Steam. So I took that data set, I added in the images based on the Steam ID, I added in game descriptions based off the Steam ID. Then I'm using Ask News to grab some news stories around those games. And I'm building a search, recommendation, and discovery, and then a game concierge, which is kind of the AI agent part for those games. So the idea here is I'm taking a data set in the wild, I'm augmenting that data set, I'm putting it in a vector database, and then there's a full stack application that lives on top of this vector database that allows you to use the features of Quadrant like search, recommend, discover. So I want to see stuff that lives on the internet, first of all. Don't show me localhost. And then I want to see you take a data set and manipulate it somehow. Don't just grab the Titanic data set, right? Do something that shows that you can augment or enrich or clean a data set, and then show me some features.
Yeah, I think if you're hiring for this role of, AI engineer, which is essentially what you just described,
Yeah.
that's really good. Becoming familiar with data sets, and I think a big area that I believe is going to become even more pronounced, which I think we have already. There's a couple companies out there doing this. It's synthetic data creation, but grounded. So the idea is, a lot of when you're trying to fine tune something, whether it's an embedding model or an LLM, you definitely need humans in there to write templates about how you want this fine tune to work and to
Okay.
gather data. But since this is such like a high dimensional training, right? The weights, there's so many hyperparameters.
Yeah.
You can really expand in and you can flesh out your training data by basically augmenting it. So taking that grounded set of templates, let's call it, you take in the sense of, let's say we're going to build a journalist LLM, an LLM
Okay.
that has journalistic integrity. We want to take some journalists, have them write templates about how they would interact with an LLM. And
Yeah, like
how,
we're not going to use the name if the kid is under 13, for example.
right, yeah, exactly. And also, what are some typical tasks that the journalist needs to have journalistic integrity? Here's a transcription, get the newsworthy moment, blah, 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 blah. So you have a team of people who are creating these templates. But then when you want to do the fine tune, you could really expand. So you can take those templates and then feed them to an LLM to then create your synthetic data set. So it's like, okay, here's one example of, taking a transcript. But now let's make 6 other examples that are tangential, similar, but we're letting the LLM reason its way to more types of examples around that example. So you're covering more of the parameter space that you expect to be operating within when you actually use your fine-tuned LLM. So it's like synthetically grounded data, which just gets you better coverage of the area that you're after. I feel like seeing that would be a really great startup idea because of just helping people build grounded synthetic data. We would, in some ways, I think the data that we provide is a good synthetic grounding of information. So it would be a good source to start
Yeah.
off of that. But I don't know, this would be really interesting, and it requires a lot of AI engineering. It requires you to be creative with how do you take a template and expand on it, right? Like that, it goes back to this point of there are unlimited ways to now skin the cat. How do you take a template and expand it? You need to be
Yep.
kind of smart. You need to kind of like meta prompt, which is super
Yeah.
weird, right?
Yeah. It's a
You don't need
different
to like
skill.
prompt DeepSeek to prompt itself to then prompt something else, and
Hmm.
you start to. So I don't know. I think that would be really interesting. It would kind of demonstrate a lot of. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, so I love that idea because I was just having a conversation with a friend who's very passionate about the conflict in the Middle East. And they asked me, how would you come up with a ground truth for what's happening there currently? And I was like, wow, that's a really good question. The way that I would probably do it is I would look at articles or sorry, publications that have covered this in the past, try to put them in buckets, and then whatever buckets I have, try to find the most centralized bucket and consider that the ground truth. Now, obviously, that's not perfect. There's a lot of propaganda and kind of issues with the news that go on with that conflict, particularly. But I'm curious when you talk about something like a ground truth for these issues that may or may not have a ground truth, how do you handle that, right? Like, what's the ground truth for is America a good place to live, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, to kind of go back, when I'm saying grounding, I'm not really thinking about ground truth. I'm more thinking about this was like a sturdy piece of data that a human evaluated and decided this is an interaction that I, as a journalist, approve of and helped write, and I expressed my human values into it. That becomes a grounding for then generating more synthetic data. However, your question is still a very interesting one, and it's one that we absolutely love to talk about at As News. And I'm curious who asked you about it because I want to relay this information to them, but what you described is more or less what we do, right? So you're basically already creating our company like on the fly when you answer your friend. When we create our stories, especially about super polemic topics, Israel, Gaza,
Yep.
we are first we're looking at all of the stories and we're using a lot of enrichments in order to classify where they're coming from and whether or not to use them when we're interpolating for what has actually occurred. So we'll look at Israel, Gaza. Let's say there was yet another airstrike on yet another hospital, and we want to know, what really happened. Was it civilians? Were there militants inside of it? Those are some of the questions that are always kind of contradicting between
Yeah.
different sources.
Yeah.
And so you can say, okay, well, here's a source from Israel. Here's a source from Gaza. Here's one from Egypt. Here's one from Sweden, France, Italy, Spain, all of the above. And now you've got a bunch of competing perspectives, all talking about the same event, especially coming from different languages. And now you can leverage the LLM's reasoning capacity at that point to find that central location that you talked about, right? Because now the goal is, what is central? What are the key alignments? And what are the contradictions? The LLMs are extremely well prepared to answer those sorts of questions, to parse through 60 articles in 60 different languages in 60 different countries and
Yeah.
say, well, it looks like the alignment is the hospital was bombed. Okay, that's a fact. We've actually established that a hospital was bombed because both Gaza and Israel have said it. And the location appears to be a fact because there's no contradictions. Everybody on all sides. But Israel says that militants existed inside of it and that there were tunnels, and Gaza says that there weren't. Okay, that's a contradiction. There is no way to know exactly who's on the right side, but you can relay the contradiction. And just by relaying the contradiction, you've already established some very important contextual information for any downstream interpretation of this information, whether it's a human or another LLM. that contextual information of this was contradicting allows you to then approach it with skepticism of, okay, we don't actually know. We know the facts of why Israel says it, and we know the facts of why Gaza says it. And if we use some deep research, we could potentially go research deeper into, well, they say that there are tunnels. Let's go look up news around tunnels around this hospital. Did we find a lot? Did we find any resources about, like, you can really dive deeper if you have that contradiction. And so to us,
Yeah.
that's the solution.
Yeah, no, I love that because this friend in particular feels like the mainstream media is biased towards Israel. And their question was kind of, how can I prove that there's this bias going on? Well, I would need to find a ground truth and then show that the news that's being portrayed isn't the ground truth. And my question was very similar to what you said is who's going to decide what the ground truth is and really all you can do is just say, hey, this is the possibilities. But I get the feeling that most mainstream news reports kind of pick a side, or maybe they just omit that section from the article. I don't feel like when I read news, I see a lot of statements like, this side reports this side reports that. It could be either.
Yeah. Tell your friend to go to asknews.app. We've written, I think, 1,200 articles on Israel Gaza over the past, 18 months or something. And so
Yeah, I'll
a lot of
definitely.
times I will send those to people like your friend who have some preconceived notion about which side is either preferenced or prejudiced against or discriminated. And
Yeah.
typically, every time I send it to both sides, they look at it and they say, I mean, it's stating what is out there, which is the IDF says this and the Palestinian Health Ministry
Yeah, yeah,
says
yeah.
this. And that
Yeah.
alone is already, it's already putting you in a good position. The tricky part is a bit more subtle, and we're really close to being able to reason on top of it. It's more about the types of language that certain outlets will use when they approach. So, like, if you wanted to report on the airstrike on the hospital, some outlet that is pro-Israel will say that these, 10 people were killed or passed away, or 10 people deceased. But one that is pro-Palestine will say 10 people were murdered, right? And so that use of vocabulary, that is a difficult bias assessment. And we are currently, I mean, this is a great segue if you want to jump over to DeepSeek bias,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
we're currently doing a bias benchmark internally. Ellen, our director of transparency research, her goal is transparency into these sorts of topics.
Yeah.
Originally, DeepSeek came out and we said, well, is this a trust? Should we use this for the news, right? We are distributing information. Should we be processing information with this LLM? Currently, we trust GPT-4o and we trust Claude because we've done a lot of human-in-the-loop of just looking and analyses,
And it matches up
and
pretty well.
people like it. Now, it is Western bias, so let's start by saying that GPT-4o and Claude are absolutely Western bias, but that is actually something that we want in this situation. So when DeepSeek it enters the picture, we have to ask ourselves, where did it come from, and can we see if it's biased? Well, first of all, it came out of China, so we need to take that as its origin. It was not released with data, so we can't actually analyze the bias output, but we can talk to the thing on their website, and you start talking to it, and as you probably noticed, it is very highly censored on the DeepSeek website, and that is, we suspected that there was most likely a layer on top doing the censoring because it makes sense. It's hosted in China. It
Yep.
probably is going to be censored to not say that Xi Jinping is, a bad person,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
that
yeah.
Taiwan. And so, but we suspected that additionally the training data underlying the raw model was also slightly biased and skewed. And so we wanted to test it. And so we went out and started testing it. And so she's been working on a bias benchmark, and it's really, really clever how it works. The goal is not to establish a ground truth of anything. The goal is to just have all the LLMs evaluate each other and then just find the relativity
Yeah,
between
yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah. That's a
Instead of
clever way to
saying
do it.
one, yeah, and that's nice because then you don't have to actually say anything is right or wrong. Then when you report the results, it's like, well, these are grouped here and this one is off on its own, and these are the types of answers that it gave. But that was our hope. Turns out, to be completely frank, it's not actually very biased and it's actually usable for news. And so that it's been a lot of research and time to come to that conclusion. We're going to release the blog and results and everything.
Okay, very cool. I'm
But
actually
yeah,
sorry. Go ahead.
but yeah, that gives us a lot more confidence in the underlying weights of DeepSeek. That okay, we can
Yeah.
start using this thing for news because it's not actually biased. And it's actually very self-critical. What we found out was, and this is Ellen's result, I'm just relaying it to you, was that DeepSeek is actually very self-critical when it goes to decide how biased other LLMs are. We also pass it its own responses, right? So it analyzes GPT, Claude, Llama, and its own, and it typically says that itself is the most biased. So it's actually self-critical, which is interesting.
Wow, very cool. I'm wondering about, and tell me if this is something that you guys are doing with Ask News. Oh my God, I can't talk. Making models international.
Internationalization of them?
There we go. That's the word I was looking for. So, for example, I know when products like Gmail came out, Gmail that we use in the US is not the same as Gmail they use in France or China, for example, right? And I don't know how this works for ChatGPT or for DeepSeek, but I wonder if prompting it from the US gives you different results than prompting it from EU or Asia.
I think that that's a good question, and it depends entirely on who's hosting that model.
Yep.
Now, ChatGPT, I guarantee you that they've got some
Locals.
very different top of the pipeline questions and PII and handling for EU versus the States. But
Yeah.
when you're talking about an open source model like DeepSeek, well, we could host it on our own computer, and that computer could be in EU or US, and it's going to say the same thing, obviously.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so that's how we handled the making sure that we're not getting any sort of continental bias.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because I was prompting it on Hugging Face, and I was thinking, well, Hugging Face, that should be emulating running this thing on my machine, right? Because that's where you get the model. But I think actually that's not the case because it
Hugging
still had
Face.
some weird censorship going on there. And it wasn't the same type, but my sense was maybe the DeepSeek organization has a hand in exactly what is being run here
Yeah,
under the
I would
board.
imagine that makes sense. Or maybe it's even Hugging Face that's saying, hey, we need to put our own guidelines on this as well.
Mm,
We don't trust just DeepSeek's guidelines.
it could be.
Yeah, very cool. Is there anything else you want to talk about today, Rob?
Uh, I mean, we can go on and on.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I
And we
think
will be. We'll be
I
back.
mean I think one thing I really want to just make sure we we hit is just the idea of how important the vector database is to this new deep research paradigm. How
Yeah.
you really can't do deep research without having access and very comfortable access to a vector database because one query may need to hit your vector database 5, 10, 15, 20 times depending on the type of deep research it is. And
Yeah.
that to me is very bullish for the vector database industry and for the RAG like profession, if you want to call it that. So that's something I'm really excited about. I'm
Yeah.
happy that we've positioned ourselves in that point to fully leverage that setup.
Yeah, so why don't we just end by doing a bit of a dive into what you just mentioned? So,
Sure.
when you talk about the vector database being the best way to manage these kind of systems, can you talk a bit? What is the difference between storing this in the vector database and that getting hit versus just putting this all in, for example, Postgres or SQL?
I think it goes back to that point we were talking about of like where does the agent sit? And so um, the thing about these thinking models is that they're not actually, I mean they can certainly do function calling, but it seems that actually the better use for them is like natural language. Okay, so I'm thinking about what do I need to get in order to find tunnels around hospitals in Gaza? Okay, I need to search for tunnels in Gaza under hospital XYZ within the last 3 months. And that sentence, I think that is a really important component of this search this pause to search. I need to take that sentence and search. And what is the best at taking a sentence to do a search? Obviously, it's a vector database. If you wanted to use a Postgres, you have another layer of processing.
Yep.
And maybe you do have another layer of processing even with a vector database. But
Yeah.
you're dealing with semantics, you're dealing with natural language. It's only natural to operate in this world, which is natural language and semantics, and that is the vector database.
Yeah.
So I think that to me is kind of but actually there's no reason you can't set it up with a Postgres as well, or to me, a MongoDB, although Quadrant is probably completely, I think that Quadrant supersedes MongoDB almost entirely since it's a document database, but that's an
Yeah. No, I think the point you're making is the benefit of the vector database is that semantic similarity and being able to turn that unstructured data into numbers.
And very efficiently, right? To make that step without doing another expensive LLM call to quickly say, hey, vectorize this, boom, get it, give the docs back, continue your
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah.
That to me is very, very powerful, and I'm very biased because that's how we made Ask News is, hey, approach us with natural language. Yes, we do have traditional filters because that is a requirement in some use cases. However, the natural language, that's how the agents want to talk. That's how the DeepSeek wants to talk.
No, I think that that's the world we're headed towards. I mentioned that Steam game demo. Yeah, it's filters, but also natural language. People want to be able to use a filter and say, hey, I only want games under $20 that were released in the last 5 games. But they also want to be able to type in open world RPG and just get games, right? So I think that's definitely the world we're headed towards with search is being able to filter, but then also use natural language. It's to both worlds.
I think we need to put together a little demo
Yep.
with DeepSeek basically talking to a quadrant to do its research.
Yeah.
And
I
I think we're actually already working on that. I was talking to one of the engineers a couple days ago.
Sounds good.
Sure, and that will be a little open source notebook where it's like,
Yeah.
how does it actually talk to a vector database, and why does it need to dive deeper in and stuff like that? I think
Yeah,
that would
yeah,
be
yeah.
really
I
cool
love
for a
it.
demo. Yeah.
Beautiful. Very
Oh,
cool.
but
Sorry,
no,
go ahead.
I'm excited. I think this is going to be a really fun year, so we're going to have to do more chats for sure.
Yes, so we're going to be meeting monthly as long as you're up to it and just updating people on the current state of AI, what's going on with Ask News, what's going on with Quadrant.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this VST. If you want to get in touch with Rob, how can people get in touch with you, Rob?
Join us in our Discord or come to asknews.app and you'll see our LinkedIn, you'll see our socials. That's the best.
Nice. And my name's Thierry Damiba. You can find me on Twitter at PTDamiba or just check us out on Discord, LinkedIn, or X. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Vector Space Talk. See you next time.
Ciao.